The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder.
October 2019, Cape Coral, Florida. The sun had long disappeared over the Gulf Coast. The streets were quiet, humid, and dimly lit by orange streetlights. It was the kind of night that makes ordinary neighborhoods feel strangely hollow, like something sinister could be lurking just beneath the surface. By the time the police arrived at the small home on Southeast 19th Place, the silence had already taken over. Inside, 35-year-old Kristine Melton lay lifeless in her bed. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, just a woman who had gone to sleep and never woken up. Her car was missing, her phone was gone, and by morning, her name would become the beginning of a story that still chills Cape Coral to this day. Because this murder, quiet, deliberate, and deeply personal, was only the first. Within hours, another woman would be dead. Killer's name was Wade Stephen Wilson, 25 years old. He was a local, someone who had walked the same streets, visited the same bars, lived among the same people. But behind that ordinary exterior was a man spiraling out of control. Wilson's record stretched back years. Arrests for burglary, grand theft, firearms charges, and probation violations. He'd spent much of his adult life on the edge, jobless, unstable, and always one step away from another arrest. Those who knew him spoke of violent temper, drug abuse, and paranoid behavior. And then there were the tattoos, the ones that made even strangers turn away. A swastika under his right eye, a teardrop under the other. By 2019, Wilson was already a ticking time bomb. He had suffered multiple head injuries throughout his life, something his defense would later argue damaged his impulse control. Combined with heavy substance abuse, meth, alcohol, painkillers. It was a dangerous, combustible mix. And on the night of October 6, 2019, that fuse finally burned out. Kristine wasn't someone who lived on the edge. She was a warm, friendly woman, 35 years old, known by her neighbors as quiet and kind. She lived alone, kept her life simple, and was well liked at her job. That evening, she had gone out to a local bar in Cape Coral, just another Saturday night, surrounded by friends and familiar faces. And that's where she met Wade Wilson. Surveillance cameras later captured them leaving together. There was no struggle, no fear. She had no reason to suspect the man beside her would soon end her life. Back at her home, Wilson waited until she fell asleep. Then he strangled her. Calmly, methodically. He stole her car keys, her phone, and her credit cards. Before dawn, he was driving away in her gray Toyota, her body left behind in the bed where she had closed her eyes. But that wasn't the end. That same morning, as the Florida sun began to rise, 43-year-old Diane Ruiz was walking along Vincennes Boulevard, on her way to work. Wilson, now behind the wheel of Kristine's stolen car, spotted her. He pulled over and asked for directions. What happened next was horrifying. According to court testimony, Wilson lured Diane into the car, possibly pretending to need help. Once inside, he attacked her, strangled her. But when she didn't die quickly, Wilson grew frustrated. He pushed her out onto the street. Then, in a moment of brutality almost beyond comprehension, he ran her over, again and again, until she stopped moving. Her body was later found on a quiet roadside. Police said the violence of the act was unlike anything they had seen in years. 2 murders, 2 women, within hours. Wilson didn't stop after killing Diane. He used both women's phones, their credit cards, even bragged to friends about what he had done. In one conversation, he told his father that he had killed 2 women. When asked why, his response was chilling. I would do it again. By now, Cape Coral police were already closing in. Surveillance footage, digital trails, and witness reports were painting a clear picture. The same man connected to 2 missing women, 2 cars, and a string of violent behavior. It wasn't a question of if they'd find him. It was when. Days after the murders, Wilson was located and arrested in Fort Myers, just a short drive from where the killings took place. Inside the stolen vehicle, detectives found evidence tying him directly to both victims: DNA, fingerprints, personal belongings. When questioned, Wilson showed little remorse. At times, he smirked. Other times, he talked about his injuries, his head trauma, his blackouts, as if trying to separate himself from the violence. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the story he tried to tell, of confusion, of memory loss, fell apart under the weight of his own actions. While awaiting trial, Wilson continued to draw attention, not for remorse, but for his behavior behind bars. He was accused of attempting to escape, threatening other inmates, and creating chaos inside the jail. To prosecutors, it was proof that this wasn't a man haunted by guilt. It was a man who thrived on control, on power, on fear. And when his case finally reached the courtroom, the community of Cape Coral would hear every disturbing detail of what happened that October weekend, and why. By late October 2019, Cape Coral Police and the Lee County State Attorney's Office had compiled an airtight case. Every thread, digital, physical, and forensic, tied Wade Stephen Wilson to the murders of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz. The timeline was chillingly precise. Surveillance footage from a local bar showed Wilson leaving with Kristine on the night of October 6th. Her gray Toyota was caught on neighborhood cameras hours later, at the very location where Diane Ruiz would be found dead the next morning. Both victims' phones and cards were used shortly after their deaths. And when Wilson was finally arrested, his DNA was found on items belonging to both women. The prosecution described him as a predator who found opportunity in kindness. These were not random killings, they argued. They were acts of control, of domination, of cruelty. Assistant State Attorney Sarah Miller would later tell the court, "These were not quick deaths. These were deliberate, calculated murders by a man who knew exactly what he was doing." In 2022, nearly 3 years after the murders, Wade Wilson finally went to trial in Lee County, Florida. The courtroom was tense. Families of both victims sat in quiet grief, while Wilson entered wearing his prison uniform, a smirk barely hidden beneath his face mask. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors detailed the brutality of his actions, how he strangled Kristine as she slept, and how he chased down Diane with a stolen car. The evidence was overwhelming. Wilson's defense tried to argue insanity. They claimed years of head trauma, drug addiction, and untreated mental illness had damaged his ability to control his impulses. They called witnesses, psychiatrists, and experts who spoke of erratic behavior and blackouts. But the jury saw something else. Not confusion, but cruelty. Prosecutors played recorded phone calls from jail where Wilson laughed, bragged, and even joked about the killings. One call included him mocking investigators, calling himself famous now. The courtroom fell silent. Any lingering trace of sympathy vanished. On April 20th, 2023, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts. 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of grand theft, 1 count of burglary, and multiple probation violations. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Wilson said nothing. He stared forward, cold, expressionless. Moments later, the judge read the sentence. For the murders of Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, the court hereby sentences you to death. No emotion, no apology, just the sound of the gavel, a sharp, final punctuation to a story drenched in violence. For the families, justice had come, but healing was something else entirely. Kristine's sister spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, her voice breaking as she said, "She didn't deserve to die like that. None of them did. We just hope she can finally rest." Diane's son, only a teenager at the time of her death, stood quietly beside his family. They had sat through every day of the trial, listening to every detail, the brutality, the coldness, the moments they wished they could forget. The people of Cape Coral, too, carried the weight of it. For years, the case haunted local headlines, a reminder that evil could hide behind an ordinary face, on an ordinary street, in an ordinary night. Reporters often fixated on the nickname, the Deadpool Killer. It wasn't something the press invented out of thin air. Wilson himself admired the comic book anti-hero Deadpool, even tattooing the character's logo on his body. But unlike the fictional Deadpool, whose chaos was wrapped in humor, Wade Wilson's violence had no irony. It was real, raw, and irreversible. Psychologists later described him as a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder. Charming when needed, but utterly devoid of empathy. He wasn't driven by voices or delusions. He was driven by impulse and control, by the thrill of power over life and death. Even after the death sentence, Wilson's name continued to circulate in legal appeals and prison reports. He is now one of Florida's youngest inmates on death row, confined at Florida State Prison, where executions are carried out by lethal injection. In the sterile corridors of that prison, there's no audience, no spotlight, no thrill, just time and the weight of 2 lives he took without hesitation. The legal system had done its part. But for the families of Kristine and Diane, justice could never undo what was lost. In the end, The Crimes of Wade Wilson is not a story about a comic book nickname or a man who sought infamy. It's a story about 2 innocent women, Kristine Melton and Diane Ruiz, whose lives were stolen by someone who mistook cruelty for control. Their names deserve to be remembered more than his. In a world fascinated by killers,